One sure sign that the narrative, the tide, is turning on Israel's war on Gaza when a former Israeli prime minister describes the war as genocidal.
Enough is enough.
Medics getting the story out. The doctors and nurses filling in the vacuum in the news coverage. And taking a look under the hood of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
The agenda never has been to provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinians.
An organization that does not do what its name implies. More than 600 days into its horrific war on Palestinians in Gaza, even Israel's most loyal allies, from foreign governments to news organizations, have been forced to confront reality. From Berlin to London, Paris to Ottawa, support for Israel is turning into disapproval, verging on condemnation over the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the Strip. Starving Palestinians have been lining up for food aid supplied by an organization that is the brainchild of the American and Israeli governments and looks more like a PR exercise than a humanitarian response. The external political pressure, along with rising dissent within Israel over the Netanyahu government's waging of this war, is having an effect on the media narrative there and fracturing a consensus that goes all the way back to October 7th, 2023. Try as the Israelis might, it will take more than a trickle of humanitarian aid to silence their critics, more than propaganda to hide the war crimes it is committing. When they talk about Israel and its genocidal ways in Gaza, European politicians choose their words carefully, particularly German ones, like the Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who went on the state-funded broadcaster where he said, finally, and more than once, that Israel has gone too far.
Ich werde es jetzt auch noch etwas deutlicher sagen. Das, was die israelische Armee jetzt im Gazastreifen macht, lässt sich nicht mehr mit einem Kampf gegen den Terrorismus der Hamas begründen.
We have been hearing more and more international criticism. Germany's is probably the most significant one because of the historical baggage, that guilt of the Holocaust that brought Germany to just accept and support whatever crime Israel has been committing. So the fact that even Germany can no longer whitewash Israel's crime is extremely significant.
At the same time, the foreign minister said, but you know what? We will not ban the weapons to Israel. We reject an arms embargo.
Deutschland als ein Land, das ja das Existenzrecht und die Sicherheit des Staates Israel als Teil seiner Staatsräson versteht, immer verpflichtet, Israel auch.
So the European government is saying, we condemn a killing spree, but we will give the killer a sharper knife. Telling Israel, what you're doing is morally wrong and might lead to negative consequences, but we're not going to implement those consequences yet. With the European governments, you can see stronger statements at the moment, but statements basically bounce off Israel's iron dome of impunity.
From Merz, of all people, it is truly too little too late. And I await to see whether Palestinian solidarity activists, students who have been calling out this genocide and facing brutal policing, in some cases deportation. I look forward to Merz welcoming all those people back to Germany and telling them that they were right all along.
Chancellor Merz added Germany's name to a growing list of Western countries, including France, the UK, and Canada, that have criticized Israel over this war, threatened it with sanctions, but have not yet acted. That effectively buys the Israelis time, which they are using to keep punishing Palestinians, cloaking their war crimes under the cover of organizations like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. After consistently blocking aid from getting into Gaza and attacking the agencies trying to help Palestinians, including the UN's, the Israelis teamed up with American military contractors, mercenaries, to create the GHF, whose first foray into Gaza proved disastrous. Crowds of hungry Palestinians were herded like animals into an aid depot in Rafah, humiliating scenes worthy of a concentration camp. The crowd surged, overwhelming those contractors. Shots were fired. At least 3 Palestinians were killed. The government media office in Gaza called it a deliberate massacre, a full-fledged war crime committed against civilians suffering siege-induced starvation.
People in Gaza are literally starving, especially children, because their bodies are not able to withstand that level of malnutrition. Even some of Israel's staunchest allies are now coming out to criticize Israel for its starvation campaign.
Because this war has gone on for far too long. We cannot allow the people of Gaza to starve.
It's not because they're having these big epiphanies that mass slaughter of Palestinians is wrong.
There's a great liberal centrist tradition of standing on the right side of history only when the relevant moment to do so has significantly passed. We are seeing that grand liberal tradition be repeated now by Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Mark Carney, and other leaders who are only willing to condemn, but indeed not stop Israel's activities at this point. I think future-proofing of reputation to say, oh, but we did indeed speak up, might very much be in play here. But those of us who have been paying any attention at all for the last year and a half plus are all too aware that these very governments have been funding and ideologically enabling Israel's actions.
Throughout its war on Gaza, Israeli officials from Benjamin Netanyahu on down have routinely dismissed allegations of war crimes as inherently anti-Semitic.
The anti-Semitic decision of the International Court in The Hague is a modern Dreyfus trial.
That argument is more difficult to make now, since more and more of those accusations are coming from Israelis, including a former prime minister.
What is it if not a war crime?
Ehud Olmert first made that argument in a liberal Israeli paper, Haaretz, before repeating it on CNN. Yair Golan, a former army chief of staff turned opposition leader, is another who has strayed from the path.
כששרים בממשלה הזו חוגגים מוות והרעבה של ילדים, חייבים לומר את זה.
There have also been shifts in coverage in the Israeli media. Although limited and more common in the print sector than the broadcast side, they are notable in that they reflect what is occurring politically.
Ehud Olmert is one of the earliest founders of Netanyahu's party, Likud. So he is no left-wing pro-Palestinian peacenik. He's the guy that carried out one of Israel's most atrocious wars on Gaza, Operation Cast Lead. So to see him now condemning what Israel is doing in Gaza as a war of annihilation, as genocide, it is extraordinary. It speaks basically of how far Israel has gone.
This moment is ripe for the likes of Yair Golan and other opposition figures in Israel, because Netanyahu is facing increased pressure, and leaders around the world will be happy to scapegoat Netanyahu as the perpetrator of this genocide in Gaza, rather than face the reality that this was a genocide perpetrated against the Palestinian people by the state itself. And so this moment presents an opportunity to put all the blame on Netanyahu, both internally and internationally.
Israel is now panicking, realizing that their strategy of repeated atrocities to exhaust the global attention did not work. That's why you had the Da'ot Ahranot saying, our propaganda is collapsing, our legitimacy is over. And you had Israel Hayom saying, the world is talking less about us and more about Gaza. And their solution is not to end the genocide, but to propagandize more, to whitewash the genocide even more, to double down on the failing strategy that didn't work.
Without a doubt, there are media outlets and journalists who are reassessing their position regarding this war. And Ynet is a good example. They're showing more pictures of what's going on in Gaza, speaking through the angle of starvation, referring to it more and more.
Overall, however, Israeli media coverage that allows for empathy for Palestinians remains the exception, not the rule.
אנחנו שולחים 5 אוגדות של חיילים מטובי בנינו להילחם בעזה, לשחרר את החטופים, להכריע את חמאס, ובמקביל לזה אנחנו נמשיך להאכיל את האויב.
600 days into this war, there have never been more lives at risk in Gaza, where day after day, GHF aid depots have produced nightmarish scenes of desperation and violence. Politicians overseas out to salvage their legacies could be enough to save some of those lives. But, as Israeli journalists well know, there will be no saving of reputations on the Israeli airwaves. The moral standing of news channels that too many citizens there still use as their primary source of information.
If you're only consuming Israeli media in Hebrew, you will know less about what the Israeli army is doing in Gaza than probably any given citizen in the rest of the world. The Israeli media has been a collaborator with this genocidal mindset and actually promoting it. And by concealing the Holocaust of Gaza from the eyes of the Israeli public, when the day comes that the criminals responsible for this genocide will stand on trial, I think next to them on the bench, the Israeli media should be located.
There's a reason that experts in genocide studies and humanitarians are using terms like final solution for this stage of the genocide in Gaza. We're seeing images of children burnt, trapped in schools. The reports we're hearing from the imperiled hospitals has prompted certain world leaders to speak up, but that shouldn't lead any viewers to think that this is because there's been some sort of dramatic aberration by the Israeli military. This is a continuation and an escalation in Gaza after so many, many months of this kind of genocidal warfare.
Throughout Israel's war on Gaza, healthcare workers have become key voices in the reporting of this story. And over the past couple of weeks, the dispatches coming out of hospitals there have grown more and more desperate. Meenakshi Ravi has been tracking this story.
Gaza's healthcare system and the Palestinians who work in it have been systematically targeted by Israel for nearly 20 months now. At least 94% of all hospitals in the Strip have been damaged or destroyed. More than 1,400 healthcare workers have been killed, with thousands of doctors and nurses arrested. The few who have made it out of prison say their Israeli captors reserved specific brutal torture for medics. International doctors who have traveled in with aid groups now say their mission goes beyond medicine.
The main thing is to come here to bear witness, because you're not seeing what I'm seeing, because there's been a complete block to all media.
I am getting very sick and tired of having, as are all my colleagues, of having to go onto the news programs because journalists aren't allowed in, etc., to point out what is happening here.
Physicians returning from Gaza have also been outspoken on how dire the situation there has become. The starvation, the particular nature of the burns and injuries they are seeing, and the targeting of Palestinian medics.
People need to understand that civilians, their families, healthcare workers are being intentionally and deliberately killed. And
Dr. Hassan, I just want to say that the IDF have said in their statement regarding this attack in Khan Yunis, they've said that the IDF evacuated civilians from this area.
You don't ask the perpetrator of genocide.
We have to, Dr. Hassan, we have to ask the Israeli government.
If you also, in addition to that response, mention that Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, the International Court of Justice would all beg to differ.
This past week, American trauma surgeon Dr. Firoz Sidwa delivered testimony to the United Nations Security Council.
I'm not here as a policymaker or a politician. I'm a physician bearing witness to the deliberate destruction of a healthcare system, the targeting of my own colleagues, and the erasure of a people.
These doctors are not isolated voices. They have formed a network of sorts, a valuable one, to fill the void in reporting on this story caused by Israel's refusal to let journalists into Gaza and its killing of so many Palestinian reporters, more than 200 of them.
Thanks, Meena. In our lead story, we touched on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. Formed just months ago, it is an American-Israeli coalition that includes ex-CIA and military personnel. It is a shadowy group that started distributing aid in the southern end of the Strip this past week. There is not a single international aid organization that has endorsed or cooperated with the GHF. Instead, from the UN to Oxfam to Médecins Sans Frontières, warnings have been issued that the GHF is militarized, privatized, and politicized, an exercise in, quote, aid washing, when a pretense of aid is designed to cover up something else entirely. One of the news outlets tracking the GHF closely with reporting from Palestinian journalists in Gaza is Dropsite News. Its co-founder, Jeremy Scahill, joins us now. Jeremy, let's start with the name of this organization now handling aid in the war zone, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Is the GHF out to do what its name implies?
Not in any way, shape, or form. I mean, first of all, let's just get one basic fact straight. The amount of so-called aid that it's distributing is a pittance relative to what is needed in these starvation conditions in Gaza that are being enforced as an act of war by the US-backed Israeli regime. It's incredibly cynical to use the term humanitarian in this name because Netanyahu himself has been very clear that this is a scam, a scheme that is intended to kind of quiet some of the criticism that Netanyahu has received, primarily from Republican senators who have said, we don't like the appearance of starvation in Gaza. So if you can create the facade that you're actually doing something, then we're going to make sure that the weapons keep flowing and our support for your war of annihilation continues. I mean, Richard, you couldn't get a sort of starker symbol of what the agenda is here, that you have a circumvention of an existing program that was effective, that you have American mercenaries deployed on the ground, that you have Israelis opening fire at desperate, starving Palestinians, and that it's all actually out in the open, that the intent of this is to be just sort of a facade of humanitarianism to enable a genocide.
The GHF's aid distribution got off to a bad start this week. The images that have come out of this, the Palestinians in those caged pens lining up for food. When you looked at those images, what went through your mind?
Well, look, I've been speaking to sources on the ground. We have reporters inside of Gaza, and my understanding is that there was almost no coordination whatsoever with local aid organizations to even inform people where they would be able to go to pick up these parcels or what would be inside of the parcels. People just heard through text message, WhatsApp, word of mouth, there's going to be aid dropped in this location. And so because the population is starving and you have acute malnutrition among thousands of children, people started to trek through incredibly dangerous terrain. And they arrive at these sites and it was very chaotic. In some cases, they were using biometric identification systems or interrogating people. In others, they forced, or almost like cattle, Palestinians into barbed wire fencing apparatus. On the first day that they started getting this aid distribution underway, we heard from sources inside of Gaza that a man had been kidnapped when he was interrogated by Israeli intelligence. They got his family on the phone. They were supposedly looking for some relative that the family hadn't been in touch with since the start of the war. And when he didn't provide information that they were demanding from him, they disappeared him. That family has no idea where he is. We've heard of at least a dozen or so more other people that were snatched when they went to go and get aid. Also, the Israelis opened fire at one point. They say that it was warning shots, but Palestinians were killed. You know, Israelis compare Palestinians to animals, and this is part of what the plan is. They want to essentially bait them into a cage, shut the door behind them, and then they either get killed in this killing cage, or the ultimate plan, which they call Trump's plan, is to take that cage filled with Palestinians of Gaza and ship them to another country. What we are witnessing here right now is a completely disgusting trap that Palestinians are being forced to as part of what Netanyahu has described as the final stage of his war to conquer Gaza.
Now, its backers say that the GHF is specifically designed to bypass the UN, its relief agency, UNRWA. Why do the Israelis and the Americans involved in this say that that's even necessary, the bypassing of established, tried, and tested systems of aid distribution?
Richard, it's because the agenda never has been to provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. UNRWA was established around the same time as the state of Israel was imposed on Palestine. And the reason that Israel has always stood against UNRWA is because it is perhaps the most powerful symbol that makes it clear that Palestinians have a right of return to their land, have a right of return to their homes. What we saw from the moments after the October 7th operations happened inside of Israel was a very intense campaign to try to demonize the United Nations as a whole, but UNRWA specifically. And the Israelis began planting stories that said that scores of UNRWA employees had participated in the October 7th attacks. And perhaps the chief launderer of this narrative in the media was the Wall Street Journal. And those stories were actually published with a byline of one of the reporters who herself was a former IDF soldier. And they essentially portrayed UNRWA as a Hamas front organization. The United States and other countries responded to this propaganda, and they admitted that they didn't even do their own independent review by moving swiftly to try to defund UNRWA. When the United States and major U.S. media outlets began serving as conveyor belts for the lies of Israel about UNRWA, this was a devastating series of events. And UNRWA has been fighting for its life. And so by creating an alternative pathway that circumvents international bodies, that essentially seeks to disintegrate UNRWA, what Israel is doing is saying, we want to always be in control of the calorie intake of Palestinians. We want to be able to shut off the water. We want to be able to shut off the food. We want to be able to block the medicine. The intent of this is to create the appearance of some alternative that would be viable to UNRWA, while at the same time ensuring full spectrum domination of Israel over the lives of Palestinians in Gaza.
You and Dropsite have done extensive reporting on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. How difficult has it been to do that? How transparent is this organization? What kind of challenges are you facing in trying to tell this story?
You know, as someone who's done a lot of reporting on mercenary organizations and CIA front organizations, it looked like what we would call a cutout, that it's not actually intended to be what the public is being told, but that it was set up for an alternative purpose. Sometimes intelligence agencies or governments set up fake companies to try to cover their employees as they do espionage. Other times they try to set up a company that has some legitimate front to it, but the agenda is different. I think we can safely say that the fact that there's very little information that's been released, that we know the connections to both Israeli and American intelligence, that this was intended to be a cutout that would serve the purpose of allowing Netanyahu to continue his war of annihilation while claiming that they're actually giving aid to people in Gaza. But Israel has been very effective with its propaganda, in part because of its allies in the Western media, particularly American and British news organizations that have promoted these lies or have not pushed back hard enough in demanding evidence. So, you know, at some point, all of these governments and officials are going to come out and pretend like they were always against the genocide. We're seeing more and more media outlets coming out and taking that position. We're seeing more and more academics and scholars taking that position. You're seeing former Biden administration officials taking that position. Well, history is full of people who want to be right through hindsight. Courage means speaking out in real time. And so this should serve as a very serious lesson for journalists and governments. When it comes to Israel, you cannot ever believe the first draft of what they say. You know, Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. In the case of Israel, you have to assume it is lying and then check the facts.
Jeremy Scahill, Dropsite News, always great to have you on the show. Thanks again for speaking with us here today.
Thank you, Richard.